So welcome everyone. I am Diane Newmark-Steiner and I am the head of the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health. And I wanted to thank all of you for coming today to join in this conversation, which I was actually hoping we wouldn't have to have, that this situation would have been resolved already, but unfortunately the news from Ukraine is not good and the situation continues. So within the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health at the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota, we have taken on the role of trying to address current issues that have public health significance. And unfortunately, there are too many of these. They have ranged from addressing COVID to addressing Islamophobia and police violence, racism, anti-Semitism. And I reached out to Dr. Shippey, to Tatiana, who is going to coordinate our event for today, because she has been so open about her personal experience. You may have read the article that was in the Star Tribune, where she shared her family's experience. And she is surrounded here with her parents on either side of her. You can see them on the screen. And she also has a colleague with her. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Shippey, and then she's going to introduce her parents and Luda. So, so Dr. Shippey is an associate professor here in the School of Public Health in the Division of Health Policy and Management. And her area of expertise is social gerontology. And her work focuses on what really matters to people as they get older, such as quality of life measures, interactions with others, and how they live within long-term care settings. And when I first met her, and I think she was being presented at a school-wide event, and I learned that she actually lived for 2 years in a long-term care facility when she was doing her PhD work. And I was just so impressed by the humanity of that work. So I've been so touched by her experience. She's the principal investigator on 3 contracts with the Minnesota Department of Human Services. She's a co-investigator on a number of federally funded grants, and she currently leads 2 large National Institutes of Health funded grants to address equity and improve quality of life for nursing home residents and people using community-based services. So really, really important work. She is from Ukraine. Her parents are both professors there, and she just shared with us that they are continuing to teach. I'm going to turn it over to you, Tatiana. We're going to hear from you. We're going to hear from your parents. We're going to hear from Luda, and we're going to have lots of times for Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, everybody. Now let me make sure I can get my slides here. It always takes more when you get sharing. Okay, can everybody see my slides? Okay, sorry, it's a little quick.
Yep, that looks good.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, now I can go. I just want to make sure I put that up. Diane, thank you so much. I appreciate this invitation greatly, as do my parents. And I want to thank the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health for creating space for these vital conversations. I do believe that it's important that we have these conversations. And I want to thank all of you who are taking the time out of your day to join us today. I hope it's a good use of your time. And I really hope that we have a lot of time to connect with you and hear from you and answer your questions. So what I will do, I will moderate this conversation, and the conversation will be recorded. So for those of you who are not, maybe who will be listening in later, the link, or if you want to share with others, the link will be posted in chat, as well as additional resources will be made available later. And what I would ask you is, because this is a Zoom call and not a webinar, if you would just put your questions in chat, and I will then use those questions to pose them to my parents and to Luda. So getting to the introductions, as Diane shared, this presentation is deeply personal for me since I am first-generation Ukrainian American. And joining me today are my parents, who are both academics in Ukraine. My dad is a professor of Ukrainian history, and my mom is a professor of economics. And you would see that their respective disciplines are highly relevant for what's happening in Ukraine today. Now, since my parents don't speak very much English, we thought it would be most efficient if I presented on their behalf, and they contributed greatly to these slides. I will tell you, this is one of the hardest presentations I've ever had to put together, because my parents had so much that they wished they could share. Each of them, my mom gave me probably 30 slides, my dad up to 100. And every day they've been talking about, well, we should tell them this and we should tell them that. So, an hour is never enough, but we thank you for this time as well. I would also like to welcome my co-presenter and a fellow first-generation Ukrainian American, Yuda Anastasievsky, who is the chair of the Minnesota Ukrainian American Advocacy Committee and a board member of the Ukrainian American Community Center. Yuda, thank you so much for being with us here today. And so my parents and Yuda will be available during the Q&A, as I said, and I will translate for my parents.
Thank you for having us.
We are happy to see such interest and support for Ukraine.
And Yuda?
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody. I'll be talking later. Thank you, Tatiana.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So my goal here today, our goal here today, is to give you some context, history, and personal experiences for the war in Ukraine. As a sociologist by training, joined by my dad here, a historian, we really want to emphasize the need to understand history and context for this brutal invasion, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine that we are living through. So let us get started. Just a little bit of context here, that Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after France. If you think about it, sometimes it's a helpful comparison is to think that Ukraine is about the size of Texas. Before the war, Ukraine had a population of about 44 million people and became independent in 1991. I am from Ivano-Frankivsk, which you will see on a map here. It is in Western Ukraine, which I couldn't resist to show you a couple of photos of my beautiful town. These are photos of Ivano-Frankivsk, Central Square and the downtown. And even though Ivano-Frankivsk is in Western Ukraine, it has not been spared from Russia's attacks, with Russia's army shelling the airport. That's what we wrote about in that Star Tribune story. As I was talking to my parents, factories and other infrastructure. And just this morning, we got news of shelling in Lviv, which is about an hour away, and multiple rockets being sent into my city as well. So unfortunately, no part of Ukraine is safe. So getting a little bit more into the history, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when Ukraine became independent, it inherited around 1,700 nuclear warheads. But in 1994, and that's what you see here on the screen, Ukraine, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia signed the Budapest Memorandum. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. When I just talked to sort of folks on the street, most people don't know about it. But it was because of this memorandum that Ukraine was promised territorial independence and that signatories will refrain from influencing Ukrainian politics. Of all the promises listed here, you could see them on the screen, other than the nuclear weapons, so far, Russia has violated every single one of these, and in some cases, multiple times. And here I'm getting to one of the key points of the presentation, something my dad really wanted to emphasize, and that is that Russia has consistently exhibited a colonial policy toward Ukraine. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia has been that of an empire and its colony. This is true not just for Ukraine, but for other countries and republics in Eurasia. Think Chechnya, whose capital Grozny was bombed in 2000. And for centuries, first Tsarist Russia and then Soviet Russia aimed to eradicate the Ukrainian language by inhibiting or prohibiting its use in education, official use in the print, what I'm calling Russification here in quotes. Most of these policies contributed to the forced Russification of Ukrainians who lived in the Russian Empire and the USSR. So when I see stories, by Western media and, folks wondering in the West, that why do so many Ukrainians speak Russian, especially in Eastern Ukraine? Well, that is why, when we have not been allowed to speak our own language. And throughout its bloody and oppressive history, Russia used genocidal famines and other processes of elimination to erase the existence of Ukrainians as an ethnic group and a nation. In 1932 and 1933, the Soviet government of Joseph Stalin killed millions of Ukrainians in a Holodomor. And what that means, it literally means death inflicted by starvation. Stalin's regime forcibly confiscated grain and other foods from Ukrainians, especially farmers, to try to bring them under his control. Different statistics show that between 3.9 and 7 million of Ukrainians died during Holodomor. And that empty Ukrainian villages of folks who have died were later resettled by Russians, a policy Russia continues to this day in that Ukrainian territories that it occupies. Holodomor history was forbidden to teach in schools and not mentioned in any publications. It was erased and hidden, and a succession of Soviet governments maintained formal denial that Holodomor ever occurred. Russia still denies it, just like it denies that it's committing atrocities in Ukraine today. I've included resources here, including, and this one is really helpful right here, the University of Minnesota, the Center for Holodomor and Genocide Studies at the College of Liberal Arts. And Holodomor has been internationally recognized as Russia's act of genocide against Ukraine. Another act of genocide that is really important to note here is the act committed by the Soviet Stalinist regime against Crimean Tatars in 1944. Between 1944 and 1956, about 110,000, 46% of exiled Crimean Tatars died because of deportation. To this day, it remains one of the most rapid and thorough cases of ethnic cleansing in world history. Ukraine allowed Crimean Tatars to return to their homeland. And I've had a chance to visit Crimea as a kid in camp many times and to experience Crimean food and learn about their culture. Since Russia took over Crimea, Crimean Tatars have been persecuted. Russia continues to subject Crimean Tatars to extreme repressions. You can read multiple stories about it. It exiled political leaders and closed all media outlets. It banned Crimean Tatar Majis, which is their elected representative body, arrested and detained activists without trial. Illegal searches of private homes and businesses continue today. Property is confiscated and individuals run the risk of being kidnapped or murdered. Thousands of Crimean Tatars have been forced to leave their native land and have become internally displaced people in Ukraine. And so I know I gave you a lot of information, but these examples, and there are so many more, are just consistent with what Russia does. Russian Empire erases the culture of its colonies through ethnic cleansing and forced assimilation. And we believe it's really relevant to what's happening today. So while we don't have enough time to get into the details of the events of the 2000s, many of these events here you probably have read about and have seen on your screens. So I want to bring up a couple of key events and you can review others in the resources we'll share. In 2014, Ukraine had its second revolution of the 2000s. The first one was Orange Revolution in 2004. And we can talk about it in Q&A if you're interested. And this was, again, to stand up for its independence from Russia. In 2014, thousands of Ukrainians took part in peaceful protests against the government of the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, who at the time refused to sign an agreement with the EU, as he said, due to pressure from Russia. When government security forces started firing on the demonstrators then and killed over 100 people, Yanukovych was forced to flee the country. He was later impeached and a new government was elected, but Russia, of course, refused to recognize the newly elected democratic government. Instead, what happened is that in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and Russian troops entered eastern regions of Ukraine. So I just want to emphasize that we're talking about the war happening now, but this war has been going on since 2014. It's just people outside of Eastern Europe haven't heard much about it, or Western media haven't really picked it up until this full-scale invasion happened this February. I also want to highlight, and my dad really wanted to emphasize that, is that besides the war with bullets that Russia is waging, Russia has been waging massive cyber attacks on Ukraine in all kinds of ways, continuing to this day, and that is really important. So getting to our current day is that, as you know, Russia launched a full invasion of Ukraine in February of this year, with millions displaced and thousands dead. You know that more than half of all children in Ukraine were forced to leave their homes, and about 1.8 million children have become refugees in other countries. So I hope you found some of this brief history and context helpful. Again, I know it was a lot, and trust me, I had to work here with my parents to make sure that I got some of the key pieces in. But if there is one key takeaway that my dad, as a historian of Ukrainian history, wants to emphasize, is that Putin's fake propaganda about Ukraine and Russia being brotherly nations is just that. It is propaganda. Russia sees Ukraine as its colony. It sees it as inferior and without a right to exist. And that is really important to remember when you see these messages about supposed similarities that we have. Now let's move on to economy and public health. My mom is very happy to answer a lot of questions about economy that you have, but just a couple of key pieces we wanted to emphasize. And that is that, of course, Russia's invasion has had a drastic impact on Ukraine's economy. At this point, Ukraine is reporting 45% GDP contraction, with the share of the population living below subsistence level, likely reaching 70% in 2022. And I want to pause here because Ukraine is already among the poorest countries in Europe, but has had very promising GDP growth until Russia invaded. We were actually doing really well. In April 2020, the World Bank reported that economic growth was at a solid 3.2% in 2019. But as you see here in a quote on a slide stated by the VP of the World Bank, the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis unleashed by the war is staggering. The Russian invasion is delivering a massive blow to Ukraine's economy, and it has inflicted enormous damage to its infrastructure. Okay, as we're talking about the impact on Ukraine's economy, we should also acknowledge the impact on the global economy. And that is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine also has implications for the global economy because Ukraine and Russia, one of the reasons, account for about a third of global wheat and barley exports, which countries, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, rely on heavily. And so knowing that the grains and the sunflower oil that Ukraine also exports heavily are now not being accessible to these countries has led to rising food prices and the risk of malnutrition for millions of children in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, finally, as a public health faculty, of course, I cannot overemphasize the great impact on public health from this brutal war. The consequences are multi-pronged. Health systems, which already have been battered by COVID, have been struggling to meet the high demand due to civilian and military injuries. In certain parts of the country, health systems are lacking basic supplies and face staffing challenges. And of course, likely not a surprise for most of us on this call, public health crises impact those vulnerable the most. And in Ukraine in particular, I would like to draw attention to people with disabilities and older adults. And I'll talk about older adults shortly. But want to draw your attention to the plight of those with physical and intellectual disabilities. And we already know that people with disabilities have higher rates of poverty in Ukraine. And considering that Ukraine is a country where about half of the people are living below the subsistence level. And I will also note that marginalizing disabled people is not unique to Ukraine, especially during times of war. But especially for those of us in public health, I see that the stories, the needs of people who are disabled and older adults are not getting the attention and need more attention and support from the global community. Furthermore, and this has been coming out from various reports, is that the risk of the infectious disease outbreaks, particularly COVID-19, cholera, polio, tuberculosis, and diarrheal diseases is rising as people are forced to shelter in overcrowded spaces with inadequate or no access to water and sanitation facilities. Healthcare workers who are returning from Ukraine, from different aid trips to Ukraine, are reporting high rates of infectious diseases all over the country, especially for children. Now, as Diane mentioned, my own research focuses on improving care for older adults. And my heart just breaks for older adults in Ukraine. I wasn't gonna try not to get too emotional during this presentation, but Ukraine is an aging country, like many countries around the world, with up to a quarter of its population over the age of 65. Older adults are especially vulnerable during times of war because they can't leave due to their physical and cognitive health limitations. They're also more likely to be financially vulnerable and food insecure. Many have had a hard time collecting pensions in the war-torn areas, despite the fact that pension for many is their only source of income. One example of Russia's brutality against older adults has been a targeted attack on a nursing home in Luhansk that killed 56 of its residents there. And then finally, I wanted to share two stories with you about older adults. This first photo on top is of Lyudmila. She's from Borodyansk in the Kyiv region. She has been standing in front of the house for 3 days before rescuers brought her a chair. She's waiting for her sister and nephew to be taken out of the rubble. They're the closest family she has. And the building was attacked over a month ago. And then the second story here is of Valentin, who is holding his grandchild. Valentin is 84 years old. For almost a month, his family has been hiding from Russian bombings in the basement of a house in the village Stepove, Mykolaiv region. There were 5 of them, he, his son, daughter-in-law, and 3 grandchildren. One day, Mr. Valentin realized that all the food and water supplies were over, and he had to save his family. He is the only one who could drive a car, and it was very risky, but there was no way out. So he drove an old car for several days to save his family. He grew up during World War II, and he said, I played with ammunition as a child, but I don't want my grandchildren to have the same childhood. Now his family is finally safe. I've read multiple media stories verified that he's actually in my hometown of Ivano-Frankivsk, but they said the family doesn't know if they'll ever be able to go back. And stories such as Lyudmila and Valentin's abound, and they deserve to be told. So thank you so much for sticking with me as I went through a lot, trying to cover history, economy, public health to prime it for our discussion here. And I would like, at this point, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Luda, to share a personal perspective from Mariupol and speak from the perspective of a community volunteer and the leader here. Luda, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here today. Thank you, Tatiana, for inviting me to join this very important conversation. And thank you to Diane and Division of Epidemiology and School of Public Health for providing the platform to amplify Ukrainian voices in the University of Minnesota public health community. A few words about myself. I was born in Mariupol, a city in the southeastern Ukraine on the Azov Sea, and spent my childhood and youth there. I've been living in Minnesota since 1990. As an educator with 30 years of teaching experience, I've been actively involved in the life of our Ukrainian Community Center, serving on the board of directors at the Ukrainian American Community Center and chairing Minnesota Ukrainian American Advocacy Committee since 2016. In this slide, you'll see a snapshot of pre-war life in peaceful, beautiful Mariupol, a ski resort that also has one of the biggest iron and steelwork, Azovstal, in Ukraine. Sadly, the city is completely destroyed after the weeks of daily bombings. My childhood home is gone. My school, the apartment building where I used to live, and my friends' and relatives' homes are all but memories. Like so many other Minnesota ethnic communities who have experienced war, Ukrainian community members are dealing with feelings of immense loss and grief while trying to mobilize to help their home country that is facing an existential threat. Since the Russian invasion on February 24, that's the next slide, I've been living in a state of worry and anxiety. For weeks, I haven't heard from my Mariupol friends and family. I knew from the news report that they were living without water, heat, electricity, and every time I took a shower, cooked, or did something mundane, I couldn't help but think about whether they were able to survive under the constant shelling, how they took care of their daily needs. And I know that they were collecting snow, rainwater, and cooking food over the open fires outside the bombed apartment buildings. Russia has dropped over 300 bombs on the city, destroying the art school, the maternity hospital, the drama theater, an iconic building that you see in the slide too, in the center of the city, where over 1,000 people, including women, elderly, and children were hiding. Mariupol used to be a home to over 400,000 people before the war. It was a beautiful, thriving city. And the size of the city is comparable to that of the city of Minneapolis. And now only roughly 120,000 people are left there, according to Ukrainian authorities. And it seems that the way the Russian army behaves in Mariupol, they decided to raze the city to the ground at any cost. As of the news today, The city is basically encircled by Russians, with the exceptions of the Azov steel plant, where the remaining of Ukrainian troops are holding the defense. The huge sprawling factory with its immense maze of rail tracks, blast furnaces, and industrial mills is like a fortress. I actually worked there for a year after graduating from high school when I was 17, 18 years old. Yesterday, Ukraine's prime minister said, the city still has not fallen. There are still our military forces, so they will fight to the end. And as for now, they're still in Mariupol. It pains me to know that the price for holding the city, though, is very high. It's the price of Ukrainian defenders' lives. 10 days ago, I received good news from two relatives who were able to escape Mariupol. The stories they've shared with me are heartbreaking. They were telling me that the part of the city where they're from, that's the left bank of the city, people from that part were forcefully taken into Russia. And when they get there to some sort of makeshift camps, Russians take their Ukrainian documents away, give them some Russian papers, and send them to the remote parts of Russia, and we can't hear from them. So one of my nieces called us very briefly, told us that she's in Russia, and we can't get in touch with her since then. And when men are taken, Russians demand that they undress. They search them for tattoos, which might indicate that they're part of the military. They also check their hands to see if they've been holding arms. And if they determine that they are either Ukrainian activists or have been serving in the Ukrainian army, they shoot them on the spot. There are also reports about tens of thousands of Ukrainian children who were taken away from their Ukrainian parents and also taken to Russia. And Russia is trying to give them up for adoption, from what I'm hearing. Next slide, please. In these slides, you see the horrific images of the victims of Russian occupation in the small town of Bucha, near Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv. Bucha did not happen in one day. For many years, Russian political elites and propaganda have been inciting hatred, dehumanizing Ukrainians, just like they were doing during the Holodomor that Tatiana mentioned, nurturing Russian superiority, and laying ground for these atrocities. The Ukrainian government encourages scholars around the globe to research what led to Bucha. The New York Times visited Bucha, documented dozens of killings of civilians, interviewed scores of witnesses, and followed local investigators to uncover the scale of Russian atrocities. And they report that Bucha is a landscape of horrors. As the Russian advance on Kyiv stalled a few weeks ago, in the face of fierce resistance from the Ukrainian army, the enemy occupation of Bucha slid into a campaign of terror and revenge. When the defeated and demoralized Russian army finally retreated, it left behind a grim scene. Bodies of dead people on streets, in basements, or in backyards, many with gunshot wounds to their heads, some with their hands tied behind their backs. Reporters and photographers for the New York Times spent more than a week with city officials, coroners, and scores of witnesses in Bucha, uncovering new details of execution-style atrocities against civilians. The Times documented the bodies of almost 36 people where they were killed, in their homes, in the woods, set on fire in vacant parking lot, and learned the story behind many of their deaths. The Times also witnessed more than 100 body bags at a communal grave in the city's cemetery. The evidence suggests the Russians killed recklessly and sometimes sadistically, in part out of revenge. Ukraine's official ombudsman for human rights, Lyudmila Denisova, said that she had recorded horrific cases of sexual violence by Russian troops in Bucha and other places, including one of which a group of women and girls were kept in a basement in a house for 25 days. Sadly, 9 of them are now pregnant, she said. She speculated that the violence came out of revenge for the Ukrainian resistance, but also that the Russian soldiers used sexual violence as a weapon of war against Ukrainian women. Overall, in the broader Bucha region, there were at least 1,000 deaths in the war. The dead are overwhelmingly civilians. Only 2 members of the Ukrainian military were among those killed in Bucha city. The ombudswoman, Ms. Denisova, appealed to the United Nations Human Rights Commission to take into account these facts of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. The level of brutality of the army of terrorists and executioners of the Russian Federation, approved and encouraged by Russian commanders and Putin himself, knows no bounds, she said. The Russian government and the Russian army will have to be held accountable politically, economically, and legally for the bombardments, the killings of the men, women, and children, and all the war crimes committed in Mariupol, in Bucha, Kharkiv, Irpin, and many other Ukrainian cities, towns, and villages. And I believe it's our responsibility to make sure that the world knows the truth about this war and the perpetrators who started it and committed the despicable atrocities. On February 24, 2022, as you know, Russia renewed its war on independent democratic Ukraine under the false pretense of demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. The stated goal of denazification is especially absurd in a country whose president is Volodymyr Zelensky, a Jew who lost many relatives at the hands of the Nazis during the Holocaust. Zelensky was elected president in a fair election with 70% of the vote. When we talk about the war, words matter. And now I'd like you to watch a very short video that tells us how to avoid the misleading vocabulary about Ukraine-Russia aggression. Please play the video.
Just 1 second. I think I'm going to. There we go.
Thank you. Russian leaders began by calling Ukraine's leaders Nazis to cover up their plan for a predatory war of aggression. Now they're calling for genocide. On the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Putin ramped up a disinformation campaign designed to challenge the country's right to exist. He described Ukraine as an artificial creation of the Bolsheviks and called its leaders Nazis. On February 24th, Putin announced that he had launched a special military operation to denazify Ukraine. Please take a look to see the terms Russia uses and what they actually mean. I will give you a few seconds to just look and read the slides on the screen. Last week, while the world was learning horrifying details about the Russian military rape, torture, and murder of civilians, this talk of the denazification morphed in the Russian state media into a chilling call for de-Ukrainization. De-Ukrainization is genocide, and the world must act. As Tatiana mentioned in her talk, the war in Ukraine has set off Europe's fastest migration in decades. More than 10 million have fled, over 4.5 million to other countries. More than half of the children in Ukraine were forced to leave their homes, and almost 2 million children became refugees in other countries since February 24, according to the UN data. That means around 1 in 4 of Ukraine's 44 million people has either fled the country or been internally displaced since the war began. It is important to pay attention to how the media influences and incites political action by altering public perceptions negatively and positively through manipulating the language and imagery it uses to describe refugees. We have to work with media because media are able to provoke outrage on behalf of or against refugees, as we know happened a few years ago. By using specific language, metaphors, and emotive imagery, media outlets are able to persuade and move audience opinion to play the narratives of both threat and empathy. And it is very important to educate the media, or when we're giving interviews, explain the importance to make sure that refugee crisis coverage helps to introduce a positive change in public and political responses. Russia is waging not only the ground war on Ukraine, but also an informational war. Tatiana was mentioning the cyber war. Now they are also waging an info war. That is why it's very important to obtain your information from the verified sources, such as the ones you see on your screen. On the right, there is a photo of the Ukrainian parliament member, Jean Belenyuk, who is also an Olympic champion of Greco-Roman wrestling, who said, "The Russian Federation has been promoting a case of racism in Ukraine, but this is far from true. Moreover, this shameful phenomenon is definitely not supported at the level of the country's leadership. On the contrary, it's condemned. Marginals who profess such views probably exist in every country where people with different skin colors live together. But I, as a representative of the Ukrainian parliament, known to millions of people in this country, responsibly declare Ukraine is a tolerant state. This is exactly where all manifestations of racism are condemned. I'm personally glad to see that the Ukrainian government condemns all manifestations of racism. As a public school educator who works with children from different ethnic, religious, and racial backgrounds, as a mother and simply as a human being, I believe in equal and fair treatment of all people. I personally strongly condemn any acts and manifestations of racial and any types of discrimination. It goes without saying that any occurrences of any type of discrimination anywhere in the world, including Ukraine, are very wrong. And as with any systemic issues, they have to be addressed on many levels as a matter of social justice. Now let me talk about our community efforts. To assist in the war effort, Ukrainian American Community Center, where I serve on the board of directors, as I mentioned before, initiated the creation of the Special Volunteer Crisis Response Committee, Stand with Ukraine, Minnesota, that supports its work. UCC is also supported by the 3 Ukrainian churches. Kramarchuk's is an iconic Ukrainian store here in Northeast Minneapolis, just across the river from downtown, not far from the U of M campus. Paradise Market, and the Help Heroes of Ukraine organization. Please visit Ukrainian American Community Center. It's a 510c3 nonprofit, and all of the donations are tax exempt. And it's a fiscal sponsor for Stand With Ukraine Minnesota. Let's move to the next slide. As you can see, our community worked very hard for over a month and a half and accomplished a lot. I'm not going to read the numbers from the slide. You can see them for yourself, but we've collected a lot of help. So if you're wondering how you could help Ukraine, one of the best ways is donations. And I'm not trying to solicit, I'm just giving you information what's available and where to find it. And let's move to the next slide. The 3 websites that you see at the top of the screen are your sources of information for advocacy, donations, humanitarian aid, and events. As the chair of the Minnesota Ukrainian American Advocacy Committee, I'd like to let you know that our committee represents the Ukrainian American community in Minnesota and coordinates Ukrainian community advocacy work since 2016. The committee's mission is to educate the public and our elected officials about Ukrainian issues in support of independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. Since January of this year, we've met with Senator Klobuchar, we've met with Representatives Craig, Omar, McCollum, Phillips, and planning other meetings as well. We talk about the needs of Ukraine, refugees, arms, and so on. There are more than 17,000 Ukrainians in the state of Minnesota. And the situation, as you know, in Ukraine is evolving rapidly. As Diane was saying, we were hoping that maybe it would end by the time of this presentation. It doesn't look that way. It's going to be, unfortunately, not a race, but a marathon. And we have to brace for that. And financial donations, especially when they are done in a steady way, maybe with like monthly donations, provide maximum speed in delivery and flexibility for Ukrainians who badly need our assistance. Ukrainian Center has compiled a list of trusted NGOs supporting Ukraine's defenders, humanitarian aid for displaced and injured civilians, and medical aid initiatives operating in Ukraine today. Medical resources are an extremely pressing need to save the lives of people in Ukraine, be it soldiers and territorial defense volunteers, civilians, or medics and first responders. I plead with you, please support Ukraine by spreading the word about the Ukrainian American Community Center as a hub for donations and resources on all things related to the war in Ukraine. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Luda. And that is why I tried to rush as quickly as I could through my presentation, because I think it is so important that you could hear from our community leaders who are doing so much work in Minnesota. I will serve as the moderator and start with questions here. I will say I did not see them when I was sharing the screen, so I'll just pull them up as I go. Let's see, does somebody want to unmute themselves? Or maybe Diane, do you want to unmute and maybe start with the first question or comment? I see you put a comment in chat.
Oh, I just noted a book that I read that I thought would be of interest to people. But you have, it was actually very interesting to read about Maiden and Euromaiden and the recent history. So I just wanted to recommend that to people who may have interest. Can you read the chat questions, Tatiana, or do you want me to read them to you?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Alan has a question, so I'm happy to do that. And I think Luda, I think this question will be to you. It says, for those who want to financially contribute to relief organizations in Ukraine, do you have any specific suggestions? For those who have skills in specific areas, are there other ways to assist in these heartbreaking situations?
Yes, we have a medical team. So if people have medical training and would like to help with choosing and sorting medical supplies, sometimes it needs to be done very fast. You can contact the website for Stand With Ukraine Minnesota and just email them and tell them that you are interested in doing this work, and you will be put in contact with the lead who is doing that work. So that's in terms of if you have special skills. In terms of organizations, like I mentioned before, both UACC website and Stand With Ukraine website have the names of the trusted organizations, vetted organizations. One of them is Razom for Ukraine. They've been collecting, they're working with many organizations on the ground in Ukraine. They've been doing this work also since the war started in 2014. So they're amazing partners. And we use money also to buy bulletproof vests. And that is done by another trusted organization. They're called Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, and they're licensed to buy level 4 bulletproof vests, which are also, as you understand, they're life-saving. So, and not only soldiers need them, but local defense forces also, and sometimes medics and volunteers. So those are the areas of the biggest need.
I just want to comment because Alan Lifson asked, and he is an MD and he has a lot of experience working overseas. So I don't know if, Alan, if you wanted to add anything.
No, it's really great. I obviously just am so, I think we're all so devastated by these reports that we hear, and we just feel like we want to contribute in any way possible. So it's great to have some trusted resources, and I think many people on this call will certainly follow up. So thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you so much, Alan. Luda, I would say another question to you from a close colleague, Dr. Katie Kajamano. She does a lot of work in policy, and she has a question. I don't know, Katie, if you want to unmute, but her question was, what are the actions we can take personally and professionally to support the people of Ukraine, and especially those in Mariupol, and to advocate for an end to the atrocities and aggression that are causing such great harm? Oh, Luda, you're on mute.
So as I mentioned before, I'm a chair of the advocacy committee, and our most current campaign is called Arm Ukraine Now, and it's actually coming straight from the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who addressed the world leaders and the community organizations and just anybody who can listen to please arm Ukraine, because as Ukraine continues fighting, it needs specific weapons that are still not provided, or provided not in quantities that are sufficient for the continued fight, because Ukraine will not survive if it doesn't receive them. So if you go to your UACC website, we have a page there, it's called Minnesota Advocacy Committee, and it has specific actions, and it lists specific arms, and it provides the phone numbers for our elected representatives, senators, and House representatives. So you can just make a quick phone call or send an email. And actually, the more phone calls and emails they receive, the higher is the urgency of the request. And that's how, we, by joining our collective voices, can affect the policy in that regard. I'm sorry, what was your question again? Can you remind me? So you wanted to know about what can be done in terms of, so that would be political activism, and I can't remember, I'm sorry, the other part of the question.
I think you addressed it, Luda, thank you.
Yeah, I did, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I did also wonder if there's anything in particular for the people of Mariupol right now that we can be doing. Are there, I know there's.
Unfortunately, you can't do anything, because it's, like I said, it's surrounded by Russian forces, and the Red Cross humanitarian convoy was trying to get there even 3 weeks ago. They were trying to get through. They were sending the buses to get people out of the city, and the Russians would be just shelling them or holding them in the nearby city too. So it's very difficult, and I'm sure that the Ukrainian government is doing everything possible to get them help that they need. But I also know I am in touch with people who are connected to Mariupol city government, and they are saying that Russian forces started distributing. So first they bombed the city completely into submission, and now those people who survived there, they are providing some sort of food packages there to the people. But that's all I know. So, but how are they continuing living in all of those bombed buildings? I cannot even imagine. So yeah, the humanitarian situation is bad, but was Russians controlling the city at this point pretty much? I'm not sure. Yeah, I will, if I find out more, I would I can inform Tatiana too, so that she could let you guys know if there will be something that's specific that could be done. Maybe there's a fund going on outside of the city. I haven't heard yet, but I'm hoping maybe somebody already started such fund, So thank you so
much, Katie and Duda. I'm watching the clock here. I know we have 9 minutes, and I want to read a question from Dr. Teresa Osipiuk, and I think it's such an important question, not a naive question at all, but it is, what does Russia want from Ukraine? Is it interested in re-annexing the entire country of Ukraine for its resources? Does it want to annex it for its location as a buffer from Ukraine NATO? So I'll translate it to my dad and give him a chance to share.
Росія хоче відновити Радянський Союз, захопити її ресурси та знищити українську ідентичність.
Yeah, and I just want to say it's so important to have Ukrainian language heard here. I've heard about a lot of forums that my other colleagues have brought up are very either Russian-centric, because we've been centering on Russia on Eastern Europe, and or lacking any Ukrainian voice. So what my dad answered, make sure I don't miss, it wants to fully destroy Ukraine's identity, take all our resources, and use Ukraine to reestablish a former new USSR. So he thinks they won the whole territory, which is really sad. Yeah, I saw another question here about refugees. I think, yes, we have seen numbers about refugees. And in fact, my own family members my one aunt is in Germany with my 14-year-old cousin while her husband has taken up arms. My uncle, who is a prosecutor, has never had arms in his hands. My male cousin is fighting, and my other aunt is in Poland. I know that on a consumer level, I've been assisting some other organizations. There's a lot of confusion in how people could come as refugees. Luda, do you want to speak a little bit to refugees in Minnesota? Or, what do you see happening with US welcoming refugees?
Well, at this point, we are waiting for the federal government to issue the laws, specific laws that would be accepting Ukrainian refugees. I know that we are getting ready. We've created the Minnesota Ukrainian Refugee Committee. We have 2 attorneys on that committee, and we are making lists of people who are willing to donate their housing if and when people will start arriving. And I know a couple of families have already arrived, and so we were able to help them with finding housing. But specifically, as you probably know, there is still, there is no law. So we're waiting for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll pose this other question from Diane. Does your father think that Ukraine is, quotes, only the first step and there will be invasion of other countries?
В разі перемоги Росії вона захопить згодом Грузію, Молдову, а тоді країни Прибалтики, Латвію, Литву та Естонію.
My dad thinks that if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, that it will move toward Georgia, Moldova, and then likely Baltic countries as it has been threatening. We've received a lot of support from Georgia because they know what happens with Russian aggression to, of course, Poland and other countries. Am I missing other questions in chat as we have 5 minutes left here? I guess I see a question from Richard. Can the collective schools of public health call out these war crimes as crimes against humanity and press for legal charges against Putin and Russia? I think that's a question to Diane and all of us here. What can we do? I've realized how much power, privilege, advantage I have as a faculty member at the School of Public Health at a land-grant university, University of Minnesota, that we are in. But yet, to my knowledge, there has been no statement from the University of Minnesota leadership on this. And there have been a few conversations happening here and there, and I believe we can do and should do so much more. And so I really appreciate this comment. And I don't know if others, maybe Dr. Finnegan, I was going to say Dean Finnegan, former Dean Finnegan, could you tell us, what do you think we could do as schools of public health?
Yes, thank you for that, Tatiana. And as soon as the invasion of Ukraine began, the ASPPH, which is our collective schools and programs of public health, did issue a statement condemning it. And my understanding is that they will also be issuing additional statements on this. Obviously, the tragedy here is huge from a public health perspective. There is a book out called War and Public Health, and I don't know if people have read that. It's not about the Ukraine invasion per se, but it gives you a very good overview of what the impact of war is from a public health perspective. And as we've seen with Ukraine, it's absolutely devastating. So I have no doubt that ASPPH will continue to move forward with this, and I suspect that you will see some additional statements from them. I don't know if the university has plans to issue a statement on this, but I think that's something that those of us at the university could urge them to do. I think one of the biggest challenges is to assure that we keep this situation in the public media, that we keep this whole situation from simply becoming another political football, that it's just simply got to be elevated to the level that it deserves. So something to keep an eye on, and something for each of us, I think, to urge this administration and the university to pursue.
Thank you so much. I think that might be a really good closing point for us. Maybe one more comment.
Tatiana, I'm sorry, can I just add a comment to that? I would encourage you, I don't know if the School of Public Health has any connections to Russian institutions, but if there are any, I would urge you to look at those and consider breaking them off. Just like I know that the Harvard University did, they actually published their statement, and they published a letter of support signed by the deans, rectors of Russian institutions. And so you can see on that list that like every single university in Russia supported Putin. And so, you know, if that's the case, I think that has to be addressed. Also consider looking into additional funding to bring in Ukrainian scholars and students, if possible at all, because many of them, as you know, lost their jobs or been displaced. And so that would be another very meaningful support for Ukrainians. Thank you.
Thank you, Luda. That is a really excellent point. Another point that I think we can collectively seek to get more attention to. Other universities have been, you know, issuing statements to support Ukrainian scholars. I haven't heard anything from the University of Minnesota and students, you know, including remotely, you know, people who have lost all their livelihoods and could partner up. So this is an opportunity to do something. We can all do something. So I want to take this last minute to close us out and then hand it to Diane. Thank you so much to School of Public Health, Diane, and again, Division of Epidemiology and Community Health for opening the space for this conversation. I believe we should speak up when we see injustice. We're committed to addressing equity in our school. I appreciate that Luda was able to join us. As you see, she brings a wealth of community experience, resources, and a trusted voice. So please pay attention to the resources she shared. This meant so much for my parents. Like I said, I have hundreds of slides I could share with those who want more information as we were preparing for this talk. And again, thank you so much for your time. Diane, I'll hand it off to you.
I just want to end by first of all, thanking you, thanking Luda, thanking you, Tatiana, and thanking your parents, and wishing good news from Ukraine. I share the concerns that David Jacobs wrote here, you know, and I think about what was going on in World War II. What were people talking about, and how were people reacting? So I think it's so important to keep the conversation going. And I see that Dean Beebe is going to bring it up with the provost today and the other deans. So really grateful for that. Thank you to everyone for coming and participating and for taking the time to learn about this topic. Thank you.